Pedro Chavarria is an assistant professor of wildlife and conservation science in the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at East Texas A&M University. Pedro, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Joe, for inviting me.
So to start, I want to go over just kind of some of the different types of ecology. Could you talk about what community ecology is and why is it important?
Yeah, well, the field of ecology has evolved quite a bit since its original origins. You could say that the field of ecology maybe started in the 1970s with sort of the civil rights movement and how that eventually translated to the natural sciences. So people didn't just think that that people had rights, but also that nature had rights. And in the 90s, this kind of was adapted in a more holistic way towards community ecology and eventually, towards landscape and global ecology, where people sort of thought that, it was important to not just look at, to not be so insular in the worldview, not just look at your own backyard, but look at how, uh, the world was interconnected. And essentially, ecology, you're looking at the study of the interaction between the biotic and abiotic components of systems. And, community ecology originally focused on those communities that were close by. So you might say that it was constrained to certain vegetation types, certain regions. For example, I sort of broke ground in this field studying coastal sage scrub systems in Southern California. The community ecology there focused on the animals and the plants that interacted within the coastal sage scrub vegetation type. But within those, coastal sage scrub communities, they're also interlinked with other major, vegetative physiognomy. So you have chaparral, for example, where you don't just have low-lying scrub, but you also have more woody tree species. And then, of course, if you move inland, north, south, California is really diverse. Then you start, interacting with forests, of course. So you have oak forests out there that line the hills of Santa Monica Mountains, for example. So community, in a sense, of course, you're looking at a small focus, but now it's turned into more of a global community, if you want to, sort of go over the ongoing trend. And I think that's important because, in ecology, you understand that things interact with one another, and I might throw in the anecdote where the butterfly effect. Butterfly that flaps its wings in Japan might end up creating a tsunami in the other part of the world. And although that's a bit of a stretch, theoretically, I guess you could say something like that happened. We do have factors such as El Nino, for example, where you can't just look at what's going to happen, what's happening in your neck of the woods, because El Nino, even though it's triggered, down in South America, ends up impacting, at a global scale. So, yeah, community ecology has evolved, but in its strict definition, as it began, it was basically looking at the interactions of those animals, the plants, the fungi, within a sort of a limited scope, a smaller scale. So.
Yeah, I'd love to also talk about two other kind of subdisciplines of ecology. What How do you define stream ecology and also fire ecology, and how do those relate?
Yeah, so fire ecology focuses, of course, on studying the impacts of fire on the broader aspects of ecological systems. So, everything that's bacteria, fungi, you name it, from the smallest to the largest. But it's examining, in essence, patterns of how this abiotic factor ends up impacting the living and non-living components. And when I began research in this field, I actually was studying what's called post-fire succession. So how does a vegetative community and the living components such as animals and others that depend on those vegetative communities, how do they respond after a fire has come through and either cleared the area to the lowest stage of development or the pioneer stage, or if it wasn't such a severe fire, how has it affected certain parts of that ecology, the plants or animals, and how will it look like in the future? So, what does the succession look like afterwards? And there's a whole field, some people focus on the strict physics of it, looking at how the heat intensity or the range of a fire, ends up affecting the landscape. Some people focus on maybe microbial communities and how they end up might restart the succession process. Of course, as a wildlife biologist, I focus on wildlife response, survival rates and who comes back when, and so on. So, as far as stream ecology, I don't focus too much on stream in my work, but I have done quite a bit because it is interlinked with terrestrial, work. But stream ecology, essentially, you're looking at examining inland water systems, and those can be lentic or low-tick. So you have fast-moving, streams and creeks, uh, and you have, of course, still water, lakes and ponds and bogs. And in stream ecology, we're essentially looking at the abiotic and biotic components, geomorphology. So how does the landscape, the geology affect the flow of water, the nutrients that flow from the headwaters to the tail end. So fluvial systems, how do things flow, flood dynamics, and then from the wildlife point of view, of course, you're looking at how do beavers end up, uh, what part do they play as ecosystem engineers and in spreading wetlands? How do fish respond to these things, and also health of monitoring the health of aquatic systems, looking at water quality through study of macroinvertebrates and so on. So it's quite a neat field, and it lets you get out there and get your feet wet and play in the water, which is why I like to do a lot of that in my labs. So
Nice. Well, you mentioned the uh, vertebrates, and I think this is uh, something I know you've worked in. What are terrestrial vertebrates, and what does it look like to uh, work with that within the context of ecology?
yeah, so terrestrial vertebrates, it depends who you ask. Technically, most of us are thinking amphibians, we're thinking reptiles, we're thinking, birds and mammals. So the critters, the organisms that essentially have two legs or four legs and don't spend too much time in the water. But vertebrate, of course, is something an animal that has a backbone. So you might include technically even lungfish or even mud skippers. There's these fish that like to come on land periodically. They manage to be able to breathe for small periods of time or bury themselves in the mud and survive. So there are some fish that have lungs. So they are semi-terrestrial. They're not fully terrestrial, but uh, uh, my line of work, of course, with the fully terrestrial animals, I've studied California gnatcatchers, endangered birds. I've trapped a lot of lizards and snakes in my time, and desert tortoises. And of course, there's larger mammals, deer and feral hogs. So, but it's a fun field, and it's very diverse. Some people tend to focus in on, they become a herpetologist, they become a mammologist, and just kind of focus in on a few species. I'm more of an opportunist. I like to study, the interaction of organisms at larger scales. So I will often be studying a couple of species and see how they interact with one another at a given time. So.
Yeah. So I'm curious, how do you use GIS in your work?
Yeah, so GIS, Geographic Information Systems, most people nowadays, use it quite commonly in their phones. You're using Google Maps, or you're navigating, using OnStar or some sort of a built-in navigation system on your vehicles. So I think most people are not aware that they are using GIS, that they are already sort of experts. If you're using Google Maps to get to your favorite restaurant or something like that, or trying to locate, business, you're already using GIS. In ecology, of course, in my specific field, I tend to look at different map layers, or what are called base layers of hydrology, vegetation types, soil types, and you go out there, of course, and use a GPS unit, satellites. You take a point where you see an animal, and then from that you associate it with other layers that you're trying to examine. So how does an animal use certain vegetation types, and how does that relate to their nesting, their breeding behaviors, or food selection within those areas. And then that's important also for looking at migration patterns, movement patterns across the broader landscape. So typically what I do is what's called spatial analysis. So looking at, from telemetry data, looking at points of animals and looking at their home range, for example, or their yearly range, and how we can use that for conservation. So if we know where animals are going, where they're spending certain amounts of time, and why they spend time there, it can help us in conservation efforts. So.
So how do we do conservation and environmental management well? Just thinking about different strategies or philosophies and thinking about conservation and environmental management.
That's a really good question. A lot of it, I think, is understanding. If you're working with wildlife, it's understanding the behavior of the animal. So why do they spend this amount of time here as opposed to there? And how can we maximize our efforts on conservation of certain types of habitats that they require for their populations and for certain kind of needs. And that's a challenge when you're working with species that can migrate long distances, where they require different types of habitats at different times of the year across continents. But it can also be a challenge when you're working with a species that's endangered and highly insulated, like in Texas, for example. We have Atwater's prairie chicken, that the only population that's in the wild essentially is in this very small refuge. And any sort of stochastic event like a hurricane, severe wildfire or tornado can just come in and wreck the whole population and drive it to extinction. So conservation, management of resources is really challenging, because it does take a concerted effort between different specialists, and understanding, the interconnected nature of different components, but also keeping an eye on the future and using models to see, climate models, for example, to predict what it might look like 5 years from now, and if that is going to help for the conservation of a species. Um, so it is nowadays, and this will probably lead to another question in the future. That's why a lot of scientists are kind of taking the one health approach, where you can't just focus in on that snake or mouse that you're studying. You have to look at, well, how are other components out there going to affect that, and how is the system, weather systems, climate going to look like 10 years from now, and how can we plan for that 10 years, in the future for the conservation of the resources. So,
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned endangered species, and the in the case of like the hurricane, it seems like sometimes it's out of our control, but how do we protect threatened and endangered species?
yeah, so a lot of scientists will build models, to try to predict uh, population trends, and it can be challenging because when you're trying to predict population trends, there's always that gremlin, in the model that you cannot account for. There's a lot of unpredictability, stochastic factors that you try to include in the model, but sometimes they will interrupt your plans, so to speak. And case in point, you're looking at a conservation, let's say, of a endangered island fox of the coast of California. I worked on a project with island foxes years ago, and nobody could have predicted that pollution off of the coast of California, you know, um, industrial pollution that went into the ocean would have ended up affecting a fox that has nothing to do with drinking water off of the coast, but you have a cascading effect where pollution affects the fish, polluted fish affects, a bald eagle. Bald eagle disappears off of an island, and all of a sudden, this leads to uh, the eventual decimation or potential decimation, loss of a fox because of this cascading effect. So there are some things that are very highly unpredictable, and we can learn from the past. But I think we really have to look at models and try to include as many stochastic factors as possible, and not rely, I think, too much on textbook examples because, from my line of work, even working with game species like Montezuma quail, for example, there are differences of philosophy and things that we learn in the textbook that we need to adapt to, especially when we're looking at um, newer ways to gather more accurate information, precise information about how species respond to their environment, um, including climate models, and even social factors, anthropogenic effects. Um, you know, um, for a long time in the field of wildlife, for example, when you're examining just game species themselves, um, there was a long-standing philosophy that there's compensatory mortality is sort of the rule where you can hunt an animal to a certain point and it'll bounce back. Certain factors will allow it to bounce back. Okay, but sometimes if you don't account for other factors well enough in your model, especially stochastic factors, like sudden abrupt change in climate that can bring a population down to a low level, or disease, or some other influence that can really hurt the conservation of a species. I think our models have to account for more unpredictability and allow for sort of a buffer and a timed response to be able to sort of take care of a species, especially if it's highly at risk. So for endangered species, we really have to have a backup to a backup, and And I think there's in the case of the island fox, that's a great example where it was a species that was pretty much brought to the lowest number you could have. And according to textbook, it says that the species does not have a chance to did not have a very strong chance to make it back. It was pretty much in the sort of this what's called a vortex, an extinction vortex, where you're so down in the drain that it's hard to swim your way back up. But the Park Service, when I worked on that island fox endangered species project in the Channel Islands, there was a concerted effort between geneticists and zoos that they planned for it well, and the species was brought back from the brink of extinction within a shorter time frame than that we would expected. So.
Wow. Uh, that's an amazing story. I wonder if there are more examples like that moving forward where we're able to intervene and save species. And that leads me to my next question. What do you think the future of this work and this research is moving forward?
Yeah, so for natural resource conservation in general, I think nowadays it's very highly intermingled with a lot of uh, the social sciences because we have to realize that humans' interactions with nature play a big part. So when you're looking at the structure of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, for example. When I work for the Park Service, we undergo what's called a NEPA review when we're undertaking some sort of management action. So even if you're just putting, a new, a toilet or expanding a space in a campground, you have to account for how that management action might affect a desert tortoise, or the plants nearby, or the hydrology or the soil. Um, and nowadays, when you look at NEPA documentation, it includes social aspects as well. So, is that action going to affect an ancient Native American burial site, for example? So there's Antiquities Act that you have to account for, and there's also noise pollution. There's air pollution, there is light pollution. So there's a lot of factors that actually we have to account for now. And you might not think that, well, why should we account for light pollution, in a park when nobody's really out there, necessarily throwing raves, they're, they're out there with their headlights and stuff like that. But too much light can probably affect the breeding, or the navigation of a certain animal, as they're migrating through. Um, so, uh, so expanding the um, the inclusion of social factors and other things is important. And in wildlife, I think it's important um to move into the future, account for uh, that one health approach that I was mentioning before, where we tend to have this view that wildlife is in the wild, they're out in the forest, in nature, and in wilderness. But that's not the case. We have urban wildlife, and the more we build closer to wildlife, start moving into their landscapes, the more we start losing farms, farmland, and start developing in the outskirts, and the suburbs are no longer just suburbs, but they start becoming part of the larger cities, and what we tend to think of the rural areas are very much connected to the cities. Then people will start interacting with wildlife a lot more. There will be more potential conflicts with them. And then that's not just, of course, a squirrel getting into your roof or a skunk getting into your basement, some sort of little nuisance. But we got to think about, disease transmission, so avian flu, and in the case of New Mexico, people moving out to rural areas might have to deal with hantavirus, for example. So, looking at disease transmission is important. So there's a lot more human health risk that we have to account for. But also, as we're building into closer to animals' homes and paving over, some coastal sage scrub to put in a mini mall or, or some new houses. How does that affect, going with the theme of sustainability, um, the ecosystem services that those natural resources provide? And it's not just about trees, uh, circulating, carbon dioxide to produces some oxygen, but nowadays, we realize that we have a problem with honeybees, right? That are being not doing so well, and of course, if they can't pollinate, then we have a big issue. But it's not just about the honeybees; it's also what are other animals doing and providing to nature for free, you know, um, so that we have to account for, because they're doing it for free, and it's going to be hard to pay somebody to go out there with a paintbrush to, you know, uh, pollinate, all the different kinds of plants that are out there that are providing these resources for us. So, so in that sense, we do have to look at how we are connected very much to nature, and increasingly so, um, and not just at a local scale, but also global, where we have way more flights coming in and way more ships coming in to our docks. And how does that, what does that mean as in terms of controlling for invasive species, and maintaining sort of the natural integrity of the systems as we know it, and what we might rely on as historically. And if we can't maintain those naturally, then how do we at least maintain the functionality of those systems, so that we can maintain that dependency that we had, um, especially if we're looking at agricultural systems, that are interlinked with management of even wildlife. So
Yeah. Well, Pedro, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights and your work. And I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
yeah, glad to thank you for having me, and glad I could share some of my perspectives. So.